Friday the 13th, Part 2, is a 1981 slasher horror film directed by Steve Miner, who would later go on to direct Halloween H2O, and who also directed House, which is a smaller horror film that I actually reviewed about a year or so ago. He was also a producer on the original Friday the 13th, which was made 1 year before Part 2. So these movies just kept cranking out. In fact, out of the 10 years of the 1980s, 8 of them had Friday the 13th films, which is a very interesting trivia fact. So, Part 8 takes place sometime after Part 1, obviously. If you remember, Friday the 13th, the original, actually didn't have Jason as the killer, as most people tend to get confused, but rather Pamela, Jason's mother, ended up being the mysterious killer who was murdered at the end by Alice. And at the beginning of Part 2, we see Alice trying to move on with her normal life, but her normal life is quickly interrupted by someone who breaks into her apartment building and murders her. The rest of the film follows a group of camp counselors at a camp counselor school at a lodge called Packanack, closely by the original Camp Blood or Camp Crystal Lake where the murders took place, and the mysterious killer comes back to wreak havoc on the counselors. So that was kind of a setup as to this review. If you haven't seen the Friday the 13th movies, I would definitely recommend you check them out. This is a perfect time, honestly, to watch them. After summer, getting into fall, it's not quite Halloween time yet, because I really feel like the Halloween movies fit that vibe more, but Friday the 13th fits well too, though they more so took place in the summertime. And like all of the other Friday the 13th movies, Part 2, well, again, besides the first one, features, if you didn't know, this is kind of a spoiler, but not really, Jason Voorhees as the titular murderer. And obviously, Jason in this film doesn't look exactly as you would imagine him, not donning the hockey mask until Part 3, but rather wearing a sack over his head. The way that this movie came about is actually pretty funny. So, the original Halloween was obviously a landslide box office success, and so a lot of other producers and horror filmmakers wanted to copy off of that success. So Friday the 13th was made as kind of a ripoff, essentially. You could say it's an homage, but it's almost a ripoff of Halloween, even with the various kills being down to the very beat of it. The Friday the 13th vibe was very much so inspired by Halloween and Black Christmas, with the first-person POV killer shots, which is funny. And that kind of sparked the killer being not seen, yet it's there, he or she is there, which lended well to the mystery of the first movie and to this movie, and everyone since you kind of can figure it's supposed to be Jason, which is kind of an issue I have with 3 and 4, which I'll get to those when I get to those, and at future Friday the 13th. But essentially, you have the setup for your stereotypical slasher movie. Now, after the first movie, with Steve Miner merely being a producer, they didn't want to bring Jason back at all. He was more so a joke character, and they were going to instead go with an anthology route, similar to what they did with Halloween 3, with other things that could happen on Friday the 13th, a part of that lore. Well, the twist ending of the first film was so successful that they decided to instead go with Jason as the killer and get Steve Miner to direct the film. And I think that was probably the smartest idea that they could ever have in this franchise, because Jason has gone beyond this franchise as one of the not only icons of pop culture and horror, but I would say if you think of the genre of horror movies, probably one of the first images to come into your mind is a killer with a mask on, probably Jason, and it's crazy that that wasn't even meant to be. So it's really cool. Nonetheless, let's talk about Part 2. So like I said, Part 2 opens with Alice from the first movie getting the X-nay, if you will. You can figure out what that means within the first 10 minutes of the movie. Then we follow all these other camp counselors as they attend the Packanack Lodge. They start bonding, and they start learning how to be better counselors, and, you know, they get flirty and all that typical teens, 80s stuff that you would come to expect. And one by one, again, they start getting axed off by this murderer who ends up being Jason Voorhees. Now, one of the things that I think Part 2 does really well, there's a few things. First, let me get into the cons, and then I'll get into the pros, because I actually really love Part 2. It's one of my favorite Friday the 13th movies out there. But the biggest con comes with all of the Friday the 13th movies. You know exactly what to expect. One by one, people die, there's a killer, Jason, he kills them in gory ways, and then at the end he's stopped somehow, which I think is the biggest limitation of this series. Unlike other series that I enjoy perhaps a little bit more, like Saw or even Scream, to an extent Halloween, but Halloween has those limitations too. Even Nightmare on Elm Street goes beyond some of those, but it's limited in scope as to what you can do with the killer in the mask trope. But I do think Friday the 13th perfects it pretty well as it goes. It's actually a series that tends to get better with age, which is funny. But with this movie, they really made it scary. And actually, I would have to go on record saying that Part 2 is the scariest of the Friday the 13th bunch. Even though it's not my favorite one, I actually prefer Parts 8 and 6 more. That's controversial, but that's my stance. Then Part 2, then probably Part 5, Part 1, and I did a ranking, go watch that. But I think this is the scariest one. It adds a lot of suspense to it, and Jason is very realistic as a character. There's a scene where he's being chased with a chainsaw, and he kind of like runs from it. And some people think that that makes Jason look perhaps weak, but it shows that he's human, and in a way that makes it all the more scary, the fact that he's flesh and blood. In the later movies where they're whacking him in the face with shovels and he turns his neck and breaks their neck, to me that doesn't offer a lot of suspense. When in this movie, Jason feels very present, very real, he's a threat, he's hiding in the shadows at the camp. That offers a lot of depth to the story, and I like it a whole lot more for that. Though I have to admit, with Part 6 and some of the more goofy ones that I enjoy a bit more, seeing Jason as a zombie is also very fun too. But this is the best incarnation of the human Jason, in my opinion. Now, with that being said, I also love the location, as I did with the first film. The camp setting is great. It really does feel like a summer camp, if you've ever been to one. Feels a lot like that. It's got the music by Harry Manfredini, which is awesome. Great theming as always. I would say on par with the original. It keeps a lot of the same beats and the same tone, but expands on it a little bit more. And you really get to know some of the characters. They have little jokey moments, which I think is fun. You need that levity going into a darker movie like Part 2 here. I really do enjoy the ending of this movie a lot, and I think it's probably one of the best endings. Maybe it's the best ending of a Friday the 13th movie. What I love about it is that our lead, whose name I believe is Ginny, I believe her name's Ginny, who's our final girl, similar to Alice in the first film, Ginny sports Jason's mother's sweater and uses that to trick him to a pretty good effect, honestly. And I know there's kind of another twist ending at the end, but even with that being said, showing the character's cleverness and offering that really gives that girl depth, as does having Jason's mom's head in like this shrine in a shack in the middle of the woods. Again, adding to that mythos and the lore of the Friday the 13th world and to this character of Jason, because Jason, I would say similar to Leatherface, is a sympathetic villain. A villain nonetheless, obviously a murderer, but someone that you can kind of understand why. Whereas with Michael Myers and Freddy, they're more evil and sinister. Jason here is a bit more sad, kind of misunderstood, and a loner in the middle of the woods. That doesn't excuse what he does, but it gives insight into the character's mind, and I think that's more interesting to watch on screen. With all of that being said, I am going to give Friday the 13th Part 2 a 4 out of 5 on the RIP Reviews rating scale. Definitely one of my favorite Friday the 13th movies. And whereas I don't rate this series as high as some other franchises in horror, like Scream, for instance, I do think Friday the 13th is one of the most iconic franchises in horror history, and you can't go wrong with watching them, especially on Friday the 13th. So happy Friday the 13th. How are you celebrating? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay lucky out there, and remember, for all things Friday the 13th, this is Hauntformer.